and he doesn't have a positive view of that because he thinks dance is the subordination of subjectivity into a kind of collectivity that represses it. So he equates dance music with marches and then militarism and ultimately to fascism, right? So, this is pretty strong stuff, and I don't suppose anybody in the room agrees with it, right? But
jazz is fascism.
Yeah.
Not again.
How again? Again. Once
It's a real pleasure to welcome Mark here, and also to have been reading your book. It was really great. Really enjoyed the sort of mixture of like music theory applied to groove music and Marxism, and the different ways of thinking about time over different levels. And we'll get into some of this later. Just a really nice mixture of different bits of theory to think about music, and probably a type of music that we're all pretty familiar with. Just jump in with the first question. How did the project come about?
Well, I guess it's something that I had wanted to get into for quite a while, and it relates to my background and experiences because I'm a musician, and I was a musician from my youth, involved in all kinds of things, mostly initially classical music, and then later on more popular music and playing in bands and stuff like that. So that's one side of my personality, as it were. And then the other side is that I'm an activist, a socialist, a trade union activist, and a Marxist. So committed to a Marxian framework in understanding the world, and fairly confident about how that works in relation to kind of history and politics and class struggle and all that sort of stuff. And becoming aware of very different demands on musicians depending on whether you're playing classical music. I did a fair bit of that when I was young, compared to playing more popular music, for want of a better word, playing in pop bands or funk bands or whatever, and then I got into jazz and studied jazz and so on, and noticing that actually the rhythmic organisation of this stuff on the one hand is the same, but on the other hand is quite different in certain ways. And so this whole idea of, people talk about groove and what it is, and musicians talk about groove, not classical musicians but those from more popular traditions. So trying to investigate that and why these two different things, and how we might understand it, and how that might relate to the rest of what I kind of understood about the world through a Marxian framework, if you see what I mean. So I eventually found time to do that, and it's my PhD project, and then a book came out. Thanks for reading it, by the way. I don't suppose many people have. I found that I had to read it again. It's that weird feeling when you think, it's not me that wrote this.
It's strange reading your own work, but it is also really worth reading. It's really interesting, really good at sort of thinking through rhythms and time more generally, not just in a musical sense, but also in a way that crosses over to sort of social and political sense. So your book develops a kind of Marxist, historical, materialist analysis of groove. Could you explain what this means in the context of music, and why you think this framework is necessary for understanding groove?
I mean, the central problem is how we try to attribute meaning to music, it seems to me, because, for other art forms, it's more obvious and in some cases relatively straightforward. I mean, people argue about the meanings of a painting or whatever, but at least you can kind of grab hold of something, and obviously novels and so on, you can talk about the way that they relate to the events that they convey and all that sort of stuff. But music is much more difficult, and so what frustrates me, or frustrated me, I guess, was lots of talk about music and what it meant that didn't actually refer very much to the music at all. So we'd talk about the lyrics of the songs and deduce what was being conveyed exclusively from the lyrics, or to try and get clues from other kind of elements of it. What do we know about the composer? Was he a progressive sort? What did he say about this or that? Okay, well, his music must be all right then, kind of thing, without any reference to the actual music itself. Or, what's the title and what does it mean? Not really being able to grapple, because it's difficult with the music, and be able to say, this is progressive music, or this is music that as socialists we should like this music, or we should champion it, or something like that, and we should not like that music because of this or that. And it seems to me that that's a big problem. I wanted to try and do something about that, to try and find ways in which it might be possible to talk about meaning. And of course, ultimately, for a Marxist, I guess the meaning is something to do with the relationship between the music and its social source. So then you're into a question of in what ways does music, and now I'm talking about the actual nuts and bolts of music, how it's organized, what it does, melodically, harmonically, rhythmically, in any particular case, how that relates to the conditions of its production. In other words, where it comes from in time, in history, perhaps in geography as well. And so, there isn't a massive amount of stuff about that. There's not an easy starting point to do that. There is some stuff. Adorno is obviously one place to go. I'll be asked about him in a bit, I'm sure. So that's the idea, really. And the reason for focusing on groove, which is a word that talks about the rhythmic organization of music, I suppose is an easy way to start. It's a good place to start because it obviously relates to time and temporality, and society has time and temporality, so we can make some kind of assumption that there's a relationship between the time and temporality of music and the time and temporality of society from which the music comes, and explore it more easily than, say, starting with, harmony, for which there isn't an obvious analogue in the social world, the non-musical social world.
Could you just talk a little bit about groove, the word?
Yeah.
That's my next question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm kind of enjoying what you're saying, just to have the
You just don't know what I'm talking about.
So, in chapter 2, you provide an answer to the question, what is groove? That you define in relation to 4 elements: metronomic time, syncopation, deep metricality, and a backbeat. Could you tell us a little bit about these elements and how they construct the musical form of groove music?
I said earlier that one thing that became obvious as a musician was the different demands put on a musician, depending on the context, depending on whether you're playing classical music or 2 big camps of music, classical music on the one hand and what we might call popular music, by which I mean things that aren't classical music, basically. Just so it's a broad category I'm using here. Broadly speaking, then, this category of popular music deploys to a greater or lesser extent this thing that called groove, and people use the term in different ways. People talk about it in terms of dancing or things like that. Sometimes it's got quite an impressionistic meaning, but musicians tend to be more specific about it, and what they're referring to is the way that the various layers of the music, the various instruments involved, are combining rhythmically with and against each other to produce some kind of temporal texture that is not what you get in classical music, generally speaking. So the notion of music to tap your foot to or dance to or whatever is kind of wrapped up in this. But musicians will be quite specific about different kinds of groove and talk about, okay, this one's got a funk groove. Before they start playing, they'll tell the drummer, this is a funk shuffle, okay? And the drummer goes, well, I know what that is. So that's an example of a groove, a particular way of organizing the parts of music rhythmically to interlock to create a particular of rhythm going on. So that's what I'm talking about, and I'm using the term groove in that kind of specific way. So then I thought, in doing the project, I needed to kind of pin this down and do a bit of musicology in this sense, and pin down exactly what comprises groove in the way that I was then going to go on and talk about it. And it's the 4 things that Bradley said. So there's much more of a commitment to a metronomic pulse with groove music than there is with classical music in general. What's missing, I guess, is any sense of rubato. It's actually a Latin term which means robbed, and it's about robbing time and giving it back is the kind of concept. It's about slowing up and speeding down. It's about easing back and pushing forward and so on, which is a central feature of certainly most 19th century classical music. People who play that music kind of learn to do that almost without thinking about it. In other words, this is music that has a pulse, but it's expected that you don't stick to it rigidly. You bend it. That's what classical music does. But popular music, well, groove music, let's be specific about it, doesn't do that. It sticks to a regular pulse. That's a kind of discipline that you are expected to follow when you play this music. And all right, there are occasional instances of such music speeding up or slowing down. You can probably think of examples in pop songs. They're quite rare. So that's the first thing. There's a commitment to a measured pulse, which is not something to be deviated from. Then there's this question of syncopation. Syncopation is this concept of accents, accented notes that don't land on the beat, that kind of defy the beat, or at least the strong beats in the music. And it's something that exists in classical classical music, but it's much more common in popular music. In fact, you might say that it's kind of ubiquitous in popular music in various ways. And I talk about the ways in which two particular forms of syncopation really dominate in the music. I probably should have said, where do we find this? I said it was a broad category. But essentially, I'm talking about the popular musics that arise the very tail end, probably, of the 19th century, but really, we might as well just say 20th century, beginning of the 20th century, initially in America. I think, for instance, that ragtime is one of the first instances that's a groove music, but then you've got all those kind of blues and R&B and rock and roll, and then you can go through the history of popular music, not confined to America, but generally speaking, Western music. So in this type of music, you get syncopation through what's called anticipation, which is about getting to usually the last note of a phrase early, where the equivalent phrase would finish on a strong beat, perhaps the first beat of the bar in a kind of classical style. In groove music, chances are it gets there early and you feel a disconnect, a rhythmic disconnect between that accent and then the following downbeat, which it doesn't coincide with. So there's loads of that in all kinds of popular music, you name it and you'll find it. And then there's a thing called polyrhythm, where a kind of cross rhythm is set up, which cuts against the rhythm of the groove. I mean, it contributes to the groove, so perhaps not the best way of saying it, but if the meter of the music is essentially combinations of, twos and duplets and quadruplets and whatever, things going in fours perhaps, then to overlay something on that which is using a grouping of threes sets up a polyrhythm, which is a form of syncopation. So, for instance, if you've got a beat like this and it's being halved, da, 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 and you go across da, 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 you're using a multiple of three against what a duple or quadruple, and you're creating syncopation that way. So there's loads of that as well. So that's the second thing, syncopation. And then the third thing is what I call deep metricality, which I suppose is a kind of academic way of saying that the meter of the music tends to have more layers than you might find in classical tradition. So what do I need to say about meter? If you've ever learned to play anything, certainly if you've been a classical teacher, you'll know about time signatures, so you'll know about the number of beats in a bar, which tends to remain the same. So things in 4/4, there are 4 beats to the bar, so you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, and how classical musicians tend to understand meter. What seems to me to happen with groove music is that you've got regularity in more than one layer. So what I just described is one metric layer, but you will find in most groove music that you've got several of those at different rates layered on top of each other. So you've got regularity of repetition at the level of the subbeat and of the beat and of the bar and perhaps what we might call the hyperbar, 2 bars together or whatever. So you get a kind of hierarchy of meter, which I'll try and explain in a minute or demonstrate, because it relates to the fourth thing, which is backbeat. So that is the phenomenon that again is pretty ubiquitous in all these kinds of music. It's the offbeats that are accented in some way. So you might say, well, that sounds like a form of syncopation, and maybe it is as well, but in this case, it's a kind of regular thing. So everyone will be familiar, I imagine, with the fact that a standard drum beat for any basic kind of pop or rock rhythm section, the drummer plays the snare on beats 2 and 4. That's backbeat. You don't get that in classical music either. The emphasis on the offbeats is contradicting the way that classical musicians understand meter. They understand the 1 as the strongest beat and the 3 as the next strongest beat. And in a way it still is, but there's something going on in groove where the 2 and 4 are being accented. So that happens, but that also, because of the multi-layered metric together, and that's one of the ways in which a kind of web of rhythmic texture is created. So if you think, for instance, I don't know if people listen to much reggae, what's going on quite often in a standard kind of reggae beat, which can be reflected not just in the drums but elsewhere in the texture as well, is certainly that offbeat which I just demonstrated will be there, probably not in the snare, in fact in the reggae setting, but in the guitar or the keyboards or both. Check, 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 check. So that'll be there. Maybe the keyboard's doing that. Check, check, check. And then maybe the keyboard does ka-chaka, 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 with the chord, just a chord in each hand, same chord but an octave apart, and ka-chaka, 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 ka-chaka. Now if you listen to that extra one that's been put in my left hand, that's now going ja, 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 ja. In other words, it's the offbeat of this, whereas the original one in the right hand is ja, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's the offbeat of that count. The other one is the offbeat of the count twice as fast. It's ja, 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 ja. Okay, so there's two offbeats going on at the same time, and then add to that a third one, which is slower than the original one, half the speed. This is the reggae drummer putting a bass drum beat on beat 3 of the main count. So ka-chaka, 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 ka-chaka. And you've got kind of the skeleton of a standard reggae groove there. It demonstrates this multi-leveled metricality thing that I talked about, but also the fact that it's organised around offbeats at different levels of this metricality.
So in this book, you argue against the idea that groove has its origin in Africa, demonstrating that such arguments tend to fall back on a kind of racial essentialism. Instead, you argue that groove develops in the West. To what extent do you see this as emerging primarily from sort of Western musical traditions, and to what extent do you see this as a kind of hybrid form shaped by conditions of, say, global capitalism?
A bit scandalous, denying the African roots to groove, because it's a very common argument that is made, which you're probably aware of. And I'm on one level very sympathetic to the argument because it comes from the right kind of place. So I'm talking about the argument that says popular music originating in the United States is essentially black music generated by those descendants of the slaves and so on. And then there's a kind of Atlanticist version which explains why it exists in the Caribbean and Britain and so on. I suppose the kind of simplistic form of that is that what Western popular music, American popular music is a fusion of African rhythm with European harmony, perhaps melody as well. That's a very common way to think about it. And as I say, I'm kind of sympathetic politically to that argument because I do not want to deny for a moment the massive influential role that black musicians played in initiating this whole popular music tradition and continue to do so. But I think there is a problem with it, and I felt it necessary to take on that argument that this was really just the transposition of West African rhythm into music from the United States, because it doesn't work musicologically. So there's a whole bunch of writers that try and explain how that has happened. The problem that they face is that in the historical record of music making in the United States, from the era of slavery through to the beginning of the 20th century, there is no continuity of a black tradition whatsoever. What there is plenty of involvement by black people in music making, but it is a massive range of music making, which is often collected with white people, is of all different kinds. Black musicians, even black slaves, are involved in all kinds of music making, military bands, orchestras, dance bands, and so on. That continued after the end of slavery. So that would be considered them playing European music, I guess, or white music or whatever, but it was black people playing it. Then you've got a whole heap of popular, in the sense of poor people making music in religious contexts and in secular contexts, which were not segregated in any systematic way. The argument about some kind of continuous thread dating from the traditions that the slaves brought with them and surviving in some kind of untouched way is not really sustainable from the historical record of music, and it leaves the people who want to argue it to it disappeared underground, but it emerged somehow because there are, inherently black ways of doing things and so on. And here we get the kind of racial essentializing that I am very suspicious of, and I don't think can be sustained. Well, then there's an argument about exactly what traditional West African rhythm looks like, and a strict pulse. So that bit it shares. It does involve something that we might call syncopation. So there's a reason why people assume that that's what has been transported into the American setting. But the big problem is that, and obviously I'm drawing on the kind of work of a whole bunch of ethnomusicologists, specialists in African music here. I wasn't able to go and do any field work myself or anything like that, but I'm assuming that they know what they're talking about. And I listened to recordings of it, and there are even kind of notated versions of this stuff. And basically it is music that is not metrical at all. It doesn't have a concept of meter in it. So though it's got a regular pulse, which is central to the music, the concept of meter, where a regular periodicity is imposed on the regular pulse, or perhaps you might think of it as a slower regular pulse is combined with the original regular pulse. It's another way of thinking about what meter is. You know, a 4 in a bar meter is a pulse at one speed with a pulse 4 times as slow combined with it. That's a way of thinking about it. It doesn't have that. There is no counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or any particular number in African music. That's not appropriate. It doesn't work, and African musicians are not doing that. They're not counting at all because they don't need to. I mean, if you were to count, it would be 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. That's what's going on with the pulse. So no meter is involved in this music, and therefore there isn't really syncopation either in the way that it is defined, and I defined it earlier, because there is no strong and weak beat. So there is cross rhythm and what you might call polyrhythm. So some of the things that I described about in terms of things happening at different times within the texture of the rhythm is going on, but it's not syncopation by definition because it isn't metrical. So according to, I mean, assuming my definition is in any way appropriate here, then African music isn't. And the ethnomusicologists who write about this stuff aren't using my definition of groove because they're not aware of it. So that's not a question for them, but they agree that this is not metrical music. And even some of the superficial features of this music that have led people to believe that it gets transposed lock, stock and barrel, as it were, into the American setting, such as clapping against what's going on. So that's quite common in African music. And African music is also dance. There's no separation, right, in general, between those two things. And some of the cultures don't have separate words for those things. So there's always something else going on with the body with this. And some of it can be clapping in a way that you might recognize superficially as clapping on the backbeat to a soul track or whatever. But in actual fact, on close inspection, it's not like that, because what happens is that if the thing that's being clapped against the rest of the music, say a melody line that's being repeated or whatever, isn't of a regular length, and very often they won't be, then the clap will shift its position in relation to the melody or the phrase or whatever. So that's quite different from, people start on what we would think is the offbeat and end up on the onbeat, but it's only because there aren't any offbeats and onbeats that happens. So in a number of ways it's completely different. The similarity is that there is lots of rhythmic cross rhythms going on against each other. It's complex rhythmically, so it sounds a bit like, a complex groove, and it's organized around an isochronous pulse, in other words, a rigid repeating pulse, but beyond that it's not like groove. That's the argument I make. And so it's got that musicological kind of side of it. Well, sorry, that just isn't the same thing from a musicological perspective. But then there's also a kind of historical angle that we can apply to this, because, and some of the African musicologists put me onto this, they were aware that there were forms of Western music that was similar to traditional West African music, but they were back in Western history a little way. So we can talk about before metrical music emerged, and the music of what's called the Western Common Era, which essentially is, classical music from roughly the time of, let's say, Johann Sebastian Bach onwards, or we might say Haydn or something, is metrical, not as much as groove is. But before that, music wasn't organized metrically in the West. So there's a period which musicologists describe as mensural music, which is pre-metrical music, which precisely has this character of being organized around a regular pulse, but without the metric component of 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, or whatever.
You're talking about it being more improvised or lacking structure of actually being like written?
No, nothing to do with writing.
Bar free.
Bar free, yes. No way of writing, if you were to write it, and of course it isn't written generally, but, ethnomusicologists have attempted to notate it using Western notation. You can't do so, you can't put a time signature that works in it. However much you might try, it doesn't, or perhaps you have to have a different time signature for each of the different layers of the music, each of the different drums, if it's a drum ensemble or whatever. It just doesn't work as a metrical thing. So just to finish this argument about history, it turns out that in the history of Western music, there is a period in which music, the dominant music, was organised in very similar ways, rhythmically, to the way that West African traditional music was organised, in this mensural, they called it mensural.
What sort of date?
If we talk about the emergence of metrical music, there's apparently a kind of dance craze in Europe in, I think it's the 17th century, it's probably early in the 17th century, and we're talking initially in the royal courts and stuff like this. This is when the dance forms like the gavotte and the saraband, and the historians of this talk about it as a kind of craze, as a dance craze. I mean, it's only affecting a tiny layer of the population. But that is related to, I don't know whether it's cause or effect or what, but related to the metricization of music from that time, which then becomes ingrained in what we think of as the Western classical tradition and becomes the way we understand all music. That's how music works. But actually,
Pre-Elizabeth I.
Yeah, we're talking, 15th, 14th, 13th, 12th century or whatever. We're talking, popular forms as well as religious stuff. What you'd have at some stage is you'd have a conductor for some of this stuff, but the conductor would be tapping. The reason why a conductor has a baton, apparently, is because it's a legacy from the time when conductors actually beat out the beat on the music stand or whatever. There's a thing in Rousseau, in the writings of Rousseau, he goes to an opera or something and complains about the bloody conductor spoiling it all by bashing out the beat on the...
Where does choral music fit in with that? Or is it more from a mensural sort of, the whole idea of music, in terms of the chorals, especially like you just mentioned opera, how does that fit in with either groove or not groove?
If you do a standard course in, music history at university, which I did, then they tend to start you off with Gregorian chant, which is, single line, plain chant singing from the Western religious tradition, and it is non-measured in any way. You can't count to it. It moves according to, I don't know how they signal to each other to move, but essentially it's not even counted or beaten out, and there is no countable time with it. It is rhythmically free from measure.
Governed by the Lord.
Yes, indeed. Well, it does tend to convey that sort of thing because, counting is earthly and worldly and so on. And, the music that develops out of that, so, 16th century choral music, you think of the Italian tradition, you think of Palestrina and so on. It is organised around a pulse, but you don't hear the pulse really in the music. The pulse is just there to guide the movement of the parts and ensure their coordination with each other. So you get a gradual development from a situation which there is no pulse whatsoever. Music is not understood to need a pulse. It just floats, kind of. What's counting got to do with it, kind of thing? What's tapping got to do with it, to a situation where there is a pulse, but it's just a 1, 1, 1, 1, or a tap, 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 or whatever, without any underlying periodicity like every fourth one is a strong one or anything like that, to a situation where it becomes fully metrical. Well, I say fully metrical because essentially my argument is that groove takes it a step further. So historical progression. And so the point is that this can be understood rather than a geographical explanation of where groove comes from, with a mixture of traditions which are held to be kind of essential to different peoples in different parts of the world. You can develop a kind of historical account of its emergence.
It strikes me that one of the things this book is attempting to do is develop a theory of time consciousness. So you start with a discussion of Bergson and phenomenological accounts of internal time consciousness, but then develop towards something like a kind of Lucasian account of class consciousness of time. Many of the thinkers you draw upon offer sort of valuable insights into time consciousness, yet their framework often seems at odds with sort of meter and structural constraints of groove. What are the possibilities and challenges of using thinkers like Bergson, Deleuze, Husserl, and Schutz to theorize groove music?
So really this is a discussion about how we understand time, and I felt the need to, go into the philosophical traditions that have tried to address the question of time. And those names, famous names, most of them, in terms of the philosophy of time, are all ones that I felt I had to deal with because they're not much help. Clear the decks. And essentially the argument that you get from that side of things, the phenomenologists and Bergson in particular, is an argument about that time is essentially unmeasurable. Okay, so obviously that's a serious issue for an argument that talks about measured time being an authentic thing that then finds its way into music, which is essentially what I'm talking about. All these philosophers are saying that the idea that you can measure time is a fundamental mistake. It's a category error. Time is not something that can be measured by definition because it is flux. It speeds up and slows down. It is not, as a kind of simplistic day-to-day notion would have it, the hours on the clock or the seconds ticking by. That's to confuse the measure with the substance, or it's to conceive of time as an empty, homogeneous structure, a long hallway within which events happen or whatever. And all of those people, Bergson, Husserl, Deleuze, and a bunch of others, are essentially making a similar argument about that. So there is an authentic time, which is flux and is inherently unmeasurable, and any attempts to view time as measurable, as having equal parts or whatever, is at best putting start and end points on things and assuming that you've captured the middle by doing so, but at worst is completely inauthentic and useless. The point of dealing with those people is that represents a powerful kind of tradition in thought, in philosophy about time, especially at the period that we're talking about, where we see the emergence of groove coming about. So these are philosophical traditions that don't help at all, or worse, if they're used and applied to the heavily metrical music, which is groove music, then they're used to say that this is inauthentic music. It is crass music. It is music whose conception of time is flawed, and so on. And of course, that plays into an argument about the baseness of popular music and so on, which is a standard feature of kind of high art aesthetic. So the reason why popular music has beats is because it has a debased, inauthentic understanding of time, which is bogus. And that's the point of them appearing in the book.
I mean, you do mention the way in which Bergson and a lot of those thinkers are seen as a sort of a way of escaping from something of bourgeois society, in the sense that there is...
Yeah, right, okay. So, I develop an argument that says, talking about the times of capitalism is something that we have to do here. And there's a way of understanding that philosophical rejection of measured time as a reaction to, the intensification of time management, measured time, and so on, the discipline of it, that was, reached a height really around that time. Well, it's gone higher since, but had reached a height by then, around the turn of the 20th century. So you can view those reactions to time as kind of philosophical reactions to the nature of, heavily industrialized monopoly capitalism or whatever, and the way they regarded that as reducing an authentic time to time as measure and imposing it on society. You can think of it as a kind of romantic reaction, I suppose, in that sense. Let's go back to the days when time was full and under control and whatever, and not dictated by the clock.
So Adorno was famously against jazz, Stravinsky and popular music, preferring instead sort of Schoenberg and Berg's atonal music. In your chapter on Adorno, you look at his critique of popular music, but also look at the way in which Adorno thought might be deployed against some of his own conclusions. You write that the objectivity of meter in such music is not so much imposed from above or in advance as Adorno characterized it, but entered into by those participating in the creative process. Could you expand on this and explain how groove might be doing something different to what Adorno sees it as doing?
So I mentioned a minute ago that Adorno in many ways echoes the arguments of Bergson and others in regarding measured time, especially its manifestation in music as a problem, as debased, he's got a much more sophisticated way of doing it, and that's why he's still useful despite some of the things that he says. So, first of all, he's a Marxist, a materialist. He adopts the approach that I hinted at earlier, which is to say that there is that the musical materials available to people are socially created, and there is a connection between what goes on in music and the nature of the society that produces it. It seems to me that that's a number one starting point for anybody who wants to produce a materialist analysis of music. He's explicit about the way that time is connected, is one of the connecting tissues, if you like, between that. So he says, the time of music is in some way the time of society. No other thing it can be, albeit mediated, aestheticized, etc. It doesn't just simply reproduce in music, but it's the same time ultimately in both music and in the world, which I think is important, and essentially that's at the heart of my thinking as well. He has a sophisticated analysis of, he's a musician, right? So he really understands music, unlike some of the other people who start talking about melody to justify their own time consciousness theory. He actually understands what he's talking about. So he has a thing about form and content, which is very sophisticated, whereby he understands form. So here we're talking about the shape that musical pieces take, right? Established forms, as what he describes as sedimented content. So they've emerged over time out of content. And he talks about this is content, this is subjectivity that's forgotten its origins and ends up in form. And there's a dialectic then between form and content, which is analogous to the dialectic between subject and object. So, that can be used in all kinds of ways. But he regards the regular beat of what he calls jazz. He writes about jazz and slags off jazz. And really he's talking about not what we would call jazz, but a whole range of kind of popular musics from that period, 1920s, 1930s, the popular music of its day, dance band music and all that kind of stuff. He regards the groove that he hears. He doesn't use that word, he just calls it the repetitive, a bit like the Criminal Justice Act, the repetitive beats of the drums or whatever, as objectivity that has overwhelmed subjectivity. Okay, so the problem aesthetically with this music is that subjectivity has no space to breathe anymore. Objectivity has been imposed on it, and there's a clear analogy here with a society where objectivity is social structure, right? The state or whatever, and subjectivity is people and will and freedom and whatever. And therefore, when music emulates that and elevates objectivity to a regulating principle, then what has happened is that this is a capitulation to authority. Okay, it's given up on any kind of autonomy, freedom, or whatever. This is music that basically says, "I give up. You're the boss," right? And he talks about syncopation. So he notices the things that I've just talked about. He talks about syncopation, and he says, yeah, there's syncopation, but it's always, in the end, frustrated or reconciled into the beat, the objectivity of the beat. So, this is like the prisoner who's allowed to rattle his chains, but ultimately still remains chained, by the dominating power or whatever. So, this is altogether whatever you think about it, and I don't agree with it, but it's altogether a much more sophisticated analysis, and you can see its materialist roots and so on. So it has to be dealt with. I mean, he goes further and he says things like, all this music is connected to dance, and he doesn't have a positive view of that because he thinks dance is the subordination of subjectivity into a kind of collectivity that represses it. So he equates dance music with marches and then militarism and ultimately to fascism, right? So, this is pretty strong stuff, and I don't suppose anybody in the room agrees with it, right? But
jazz is fascism.
yeah.
Is that like an early critique of what we now understand as commercial pop?
Well, it is.
Is that how you...
Yeah, but there are people who evade this critique by saying, well, he's really talking about the big Moochie dance bands of the period, and no doubt he is, but I don't think there's a way out there. You can't evade the critique like that because he's essentially talking about groove. And so, all right, you might say, well, I don't like the groove of those dance bands and I much prefer bebop, but, that's not going to help you with the critique. You do have to kind of deal with it. And that's the problem that all of us face in Marxist aesthetics of music, is that we have to come to terms with Adorno one way or another, because we can't just say Adorno's a wanker. Because he is not. He has he is the first person to develop, and it's still the most sophisticated materialist, understanding of how to understand music in a materialist manner.
But I'm just intrigued by this point that Marxism. Are you sort of saying it because it's like Adorno's alluding to the fact that because it's repetitive and then it creates a mass interest? At the same time, you get mass strength by mass being a Marxist, but also you'd be exploited by this. This is what I'm saying about commercial music.
And it could should be directed elsewhere. I think he thinks we should be. From what I understand, we should be educating ourselves to unite to fight fascism.
That isn't it. It's an aesthetic argument. Okay. Primarily, it's an aesthetic argument. So, what's wrong with the music is not that too many people like it or they should be doing something else or anything like that. It's that the balance of its elements is wrong and regressive. It's aesthetically inferior in a political way. That's the other thing about him. And you can see how political this is. He's not saying this is bad music according to some yardstick that I'm inventing. He is attempting to say, look how... Because objectivity in the music has overwhelmed subjectivity, that's analogous to a social situation.
So is it elitist then? So it's sort of an elitist perspective. Sorry, I'm trying to get my head on it.
Well, he's been accused of that too, but actually he's as hard on Wagner, Stravinsky, and a bunch of other people as he is on jazz, for similar reasons. He talks about Wagner in more or less the same kind of way, using the same objectivity, subjectivity argument. He says at one point that big chunks of Wagner's operatic music seem to have been mapped out in advance and then filled in with material. And that's exactly the same critique he makes of pop music when he says that, you've got these 32 bar standard forms of his day. That is the standard form of a popular song, 4 8-bar periods, A, B, A, or something like that. And he says the form's been mapped out in advance. How could it be otherwise? Otherwise, why are they all the same? And then what happens is it's filled in with music, which is subjectivity, content, right? So form is prioritized, and form, he explicitly says, is analogous to, as I said, social structure, the state, or whatever. It is, and he draws this. I think he does it explicitly, but if you know Marx is on the Jewish question. There's passages in there which is part of his critique. You probably find it elsewhere, probably find it in some of the writings on Hegel and the state and so on. But Marx says, as part of his critique of liberalism or the bourgeois notion of freedom, that society for the liberal or the bourgeois appears as an external framework to which the people are required to fit. So the state is not the political expression of the population. it is a framework that is imposed on the population. There's a disconnect. This is a form and content disconnect that Adorno picks up and applies to music, right? It's the same argument.
If you think about not just Adorno of that generation, but think of the rest of the Frankfurt School, what's so interesting about that generation, if you look at Bloch, Brecht and Benjamin, as well as Adorno, they all disagree with each other ferociously about what music they like, what culture they like, what modernist texts they like. I mean, Adorno is the one who writes the most about music, but if you were to juxtapose Benjamin and Adorno, they both write about Disney culture, and Adorno abominates it because he says you'll put Donald Duck, and what he's teaching the masses is how to acts of resistance, but you'll ultimately get marmalized and you'll get subdued. Whereas Benjamin looks at Mickey Mouse and he'll see that in those cartoons there are moments of resistance, there's moments of hope, there are moments of possibility. And he even sees within the most banal forms of Disney popular culture that the consumers of that culture can find reasons to resist. It's a much less pessimistic prognosis. And I'm just wondering whether there's something equivalent in the music theory that if you broadened your argument from simply Adorno, who's very pessimistic and incredibly bleak, and I'm persuaded by that because that's my temperament, but there are other people writing at exactly the same time who have gone through the same Benjamin's suicide in 1940, all the rest. I think in some ways a more complicated relationship to popular culture lets you in and sees actually it's not just the dominant culture producing a music which turns people into passive consumers and numbs their brains, but actually sees consumers as being able to listen to this music. But the people who are listening to the raves before 1994 act and finding ways of resistance within that might be less bleak and maybe, as I said, if you broaden your reading.
Make it sound like
not you personally,
everything on Adorno. No, the problem is, of course there are these people, but no one makes the aesthetic argument, which is that there are ways of adopting the fundamental perspective about the relationship of music and society. So you can say what you like about, there's a moment of resistance or whatever. It strikes me as trivial in relation to arguments like this, which are really cementing in a Marxian way where to look for the elements of the social in music. Music is not something to be listened to and find nice things that might inspire you to do somebody go out and beat up a fascist or whatever. That's not what's going on here. This is getting to the roots of how to understand the relationship between music and society, how to develop a materialist framework of analysis that even gets you to stage one, so you don't end up saying, well, I like that and it inspires me, and I'm sorry you don't agree. Which is where you're left unless you can pin down what the relationship is. Don't you think? There's got to be some, analytical framework that allows you to even begin to talk about this and to say, stuff that goes on in music that you're able to talk about, you have to talk about in a musicological way, because if you're serious about addressing the music, it's not just how it sounds or how it feels to you, it's about, well, what's going on here, how are chords, melody, rhythm, whatever being used in this way, how do you relate that to society and everything that society involves, politics ultimately, and stuff like that. And that's what Adorno's doing, and he's the only person really, that's made a serious effort at that, and that's why those of us who are involved in doing this stuff, trying to do what I call Marxist musicology, it's not a great name for it because it's not exclusively musicological. We have to start with Adorno, and I don't know anybody who disagrees with that, because you're left kind of rootless if you don't deal with it.
You disagree with him, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Could I argue, I know you would disagree with him, what's the opposite argument?
Well, it's not really an opposite argument. It's about going, what's positive about it is the notion that musical material, which I described earlier as the resources available for a musician, for music making, are inevitably and irredeemably social, and that some kinds of connections between aspects of the musical material and the nature of society can be drawn such that you can start to talk, in a sense, politically about music. Not about, as I said at the very beginning, not about what the lyrics are or the opera's about or whatever, but about the music itself. So this notion of subjectivity and objectivity is obviously a way of doing that. Now, Adorno's problem is that, it seems to me, is that his concept of... He knows that subjectivity is a bourgeois construct and wants to critique it, but he can't let it go. He doesn't think it's time to let it go. So he has this very individualized notion of subjectivity, which he clings to. So that's one of the problems. For him, subjectivity is just the individual. So any thought of collective subjectivity, which, of course, you find in a sense, or he doesn't use the phrase, in Marx with the concept of the proletariat and its agency and so on, he doesn't have that. So that's a problem. That's a problem for Adorno's Marxism. But it seems to me it doesn't necessarily destroy the ability to look at, to have apply the concepts of subjectivity and objectivity to music in the form, in the realm of form and content. And you don't need to come to the conclusions about the rigidity of objectivity in the form of, a repetitive beat that Adorno does. So Bradley read out something that you picked out, which is there's a way of understanding what happens when groove music is made that does not feel like and may not be the imposition from the outside of an external framework of regularity. It may be, and this certainly feels like this in my experience, a kind of agreement amongst the people involved who are about to play together that you're going to do it according to some particular rhythmic framework. It strikes me that that's completely different. I mean, it may be a form of objectivity, but it's not one that is assumed to be externally imposed and thereby a system of domination. And so there's a whole argument here about, Adorno thinks that, so he has that critique of the relationship between subjectivity and objectivity in this music, and he regards the objectivity as being represented by the bass drum, or I think he actually says bass drum, which is a kind of crude way of saying it, but that's the point he makes. Good music, aesthetically successful music, which is also politically better, involves a much more dialectical relationship between subject and object, right? I mean, this is like saying, to go back to the analogy of society, that, the public expression of the citizenry of a society should emerge from the citizenry themselves, right? There's rather than being imposed. Okay, so that's a political thing involved here. A free society is one where you're not oppressed by the state, is one way of kind of saying it. So you're immediately into politics when you're talking about this. So this is useful. You can use the reference of subject and object and argue against Adorno to say, well, you've misunderstood the relationship here. And in genuine groove music, which is a participatory process, which is something that doesn't appear in Adorno's thinking. I'm not sure how he thinks this music comes about, and possibly it's music that's been composed and written and put on the stands of the big bands that play it. I don't know. So it's come from outside. But most groove music that I've been talking about isn't produced in that way. It comes about through a collective process of music making, jamming, improvising, and whatever.
Arguably much more than classical music.
Absolutely, yeah, exactly. And
did you think everyone should be avant-garde solo musicians? What's the opposite?
Okay, well, it's a very good question. It's a very good question. Beethoven he talks about a lot because he regards Beethoven's ways of resolving the problem of the dialectic of, potential conflict between subject and object, and the way he organises time in music as exemplary of the right understanding, let's say it like that, I can't think of a better way of saying it, of historical time, the way that time moves historically. You know, Adorno reckons that the way that Beethoven builds his structures are ones in which, you know, the overall form does emerge organically from the development of the material, the subjectivity, if you like, within it. In particular, repetition is one of the issues here. Music is repetitive quite a lot of the time, right? Adorno thinks that straight repetition, pure repetition, exact repetition is problematic because it's problematic in a temporal sense, because it signifies some kind of cyclic return or, you know, ultimately stasis. So music which simply repeats does not adequately convey historical time. Important for a Marxist to understand historical time and development. It's important for the possibility of a future that is not capitalist, to understand, you know, time that isn't simply going around the block, as it were. So there is repetition in Beethoven, but there's, you know, Adorno talks about the way that when themes return in Beethoven, they've always been transformed by what's happened in between. So they come back slightly differently. In other words, you know, they're not just dropped there in this, you know, this way, or we'll have a bit of that again. They come back, but in the way that, I don't know, let's say a person who's been traveling, my kids who went off and traveled in, you know, East Asia and Latin America like kids do, and then came back, they come back transformed, right? Inevitably, they've had a bunch of experiences. That's what Beethoven does. You should be aware that in the terminology of classical form, musicological terminology, especially in terms of symphonies, the main themes are referred to as subjects. Okay, that's, you know, I mean, I don't know where the origin of this is, but, you know, Adorno is clearly picking up on that. So a subject can be viewed as a person, a subject in the sense of a theme. First, the primary theme of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony is a person. You know, when it comes back, as it inevitably does, because music is repetitive and themes come back, it comes back differently because a bunch of stuff has happened in the meantime. So Adorno says that's how music should be, and music that simply plonks the verse again after the chorus in exactly the same form is not doing that. And therefore it's not configuring, you know, an adequate, or it's a retrogressive notion of time. Politically, it's retrogressive, right? I mean, this is important stuff, right? You can't just go out and find some thinkers that say, I like that because it's a possibility of resistance. Don't you agree, David? You've got to grapple with this shit because it's getting to the nuts and bolts of the music.
Doesn't he also like Schoenberg as well?
Yeah.
And that's for a different reason.
For a different reason, although there's probably temporality involved in it as well. But yes, he's committed to avant-gardism because he thinks that the danger of commodification of cultural forms has, you know, threatens them because commodification will do all of these shitty things, you know, produce music in all this shitty way that will be aesthetically crap and politically regressive, and therefore the only way to avoid this is to be so kind of avant-garde. And
he sounds ahead of his time in numbers.
He's a fascinating person with all kinds of problems with him, but I don't think you can avoid him. You see, and there's, just to finish on because we probably shouldn't spend all the time, although he tends to dominate when you get into him. There's other stuff about Adorno's aesthetic theory. He says that, so in a wider sense, it's a book called Aesthetic Theory by him, which is, I mean, it's great stuff, difficult. But he talks about art having its roots in mimesis, right? Meaning copying or making oneself like something. We have paintings of things which are mimetic of the things that they are painting of. And he says all art has that source. But what, as art has developed, especially during the bourgeois era, rationality has come to dominate. You know, so this is a familiar argument about enlightenment, reason, logic, and so on, the development of the productive forces, which he thinks has applied to music. So again, it's dialectical. So on the one hand, artists, composers included, have managed to secure control over nature with the development of science and knowledge and the application of industrial techniques and whatever. And just like that development, there is a dialectical thing going on there. There is a good side to that because control is good. It's a power that can be used, and so on. But there is a bad side to it as well, which is to introduce instrumental rationality and all kinds of stuff. So there's a way of talking about. He talks about the way pitch has been rationalized in music, and actually he follows on, interestingly, from Max Weber, the sociologist, who wrote a really nice little book that not many people seem to be aware of about rationality in music. So Adorno kind of follows this and talks about the way pitch has been rationalized. So what he's talking about here is our system of scales and tonality. The black and white notes on the keyboard of the piano, the even step between semitones, our key system, and so on, which didn't come from thin air, right? Is a historical product. It's based on kind of simple ratios of frequencies of pitches to each other, but people will know that the two notes an octave apart have a frequency ratio of 2 to 1, right? A fifth apart, 3 to 2, etc. So they're simple. So we can regard those as kind of natural, if you like, in some sense. But the system that allows us to play, to have 12 keys, which are all the same as each other, and to allow us to play any particular piece of music in any key, and all the relationships remain the same as they were in the other key. That whole system was an invention. It's a bourgeois invention, right? It comes about in the 17th century, okay? That's the rationalization, okay? With its good side, fantastic power gives to composers, and Johann Sebastian Bach was one of the first people to kind of use it, and you can see him jumping for joy with this. He writes a whole set of stuff, deliberately one in every key, right? Because he fucking can, right? For the first time in history, okay? So that's power to the composer, but and it results in a sophistication, an increased sophistication of our ears. The musical powers of people as listeners develop as a result of this, because it attenuates our the exactness or our what am I talking about? The way that we can decide when someone's in tune or out of tune becomes much more focused, because the pitches are defined in a way that prior they would have been kind of more rough, and so on. So all of this enhances the powers of the musical powers of human beings. Not to be too overblown about it, but Weber talks about all of this, and Adorno agrees. Now, what doesn't happen is a parallel argument about rhythm. And it seems to me there's a problem there, because rhythm, when it's found in exactitude, because what we're talking about, a pitch system, is defining pitches in their exactness and making music built on that exactness, right? The thing you lose, by the way, of course, is all the flexibility of what might have existed in the cracks between the notes. That's the downside of that kind of rationalization. And we should be aware of it. Tonality is a fantastic thing, but before there was tonality, there was kind of freedom, if you like, of a sort. The freedom of of less of a rigid framework, if you like. Okay, but why can't we use the same argument, and this is one of the points I made, this is kind of using Adorno against Adorno type of thing. Can we not use the same kind of approach when thinking about rhythmic organisation? Can we not say that meter in the first instance, but in particular groove with its insistence on exactness? I mean, this is, when I said at the beginning the demands put on a popular musician are different. The exactness with which you're required to play rhythmically is surely analogous to the exactness of pitch in the pitch system, and therefore confers power in an aesthetic sense, because just as you're able to kind of be more discerning about what's in tune and what's out of tune, pitch in a pitch sense, then what it's done to us, what the groove has done to us, and this music, in the way that it weaves a web of offbeats and backbeats and syncopations and all the rest of it, has produced a refinement of our discernment of timing. That's power, right? So instead of hearing, let's say in a funk groove, when the drummer decides to, although the main thing is, like I described earlier, the backbeat is the snare drum is on the backbeat 2 and 4. The drummer decides, I'm going to throw that snare beat in a semiquaver late this time, or a semiquaver earlier. I'm going to mix it up a bit and introduce a kind of extra syncopation there. It's only because of the discernment that we have as a result of the strictness of the framework that allows us to understand what he's done or she's done. Because without that framework, that early or late beat could have just been understood as a human error, right? Oh, played a bit late there. No, it was absolutely spot on, but deliberately off the thing. But you can only tell because you have developed the musical material, the rhythmic material, to the extent that groove does. So there's a way of making an argument about rationalization and so on in musical materials that validates, is parallel to the argument about pitch and validates, groove music, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
Cynical about it, like you were saying, and there's plenty of optimism in it that he missed. Right?
Yeah, or that's an inconsistency, it seems to me, in his thinking. If you're going to make an argument about pitch, but then not make the same argument about rhythm, then you've been inconsistent, and you've allowed some sort of prejudice probably to get in the way.
I've got about 4 more questions, so I'm going to try and get through them. In discussing the development of capitalism, you discuss Marx's account of abstract labour time. Could you tell us a little bit about what abstract labour time is and how it informs how time is measured under capitalism? Okay, so, as a result of the inquiry, as it were, this question of abstract time comes up because that's the accusation that the philosophers, including Adorno, are making about this. This is abstract time, this is not concrete time, measured time is abstract time, and so on. Well, of course, this is central to Marx's theorization of how capitalism works as an economic system. It's at the very beginning of Capital Volume 1, and stuff about commodities. It's use value versus exchange value. It's about solving the problem of how apparently incommensurable commodities, products of human labour, can be even brought together in the notion of exchanging one for another, or in definite proportions and so on. And as you will probably know, I'm assuming some knowledge here, but Marx develops a theory that says that the value of commodities under capitalism is determined by the amount of labour that's gone into them, or more specifically, the amount of socially useful labour time that has gone into them. That's what enables, I think his example is a coat and a bag of grain or something to be exchanged in definite proportions in the first place, because from use value, the use value can be bracketed off. The fact that a coat keeps you warm and grain feeds your cattle is put to one side, and what's left is exchange value, which is determined by the amount of time that's been involved in producing the commodities. And of course, what it also is bracketed here is
what kind of labour has been involved in it. So it's not really an equivalence of concrete labour, because the labour goes into making a coat is very different labour from producing grains. And so that has to be kind of disregarded as well. And you're left with abstract time as the measure of value under capitalism, which allows exchange and profits and everything else to be made. That's essentially Marx's argument. So what follows from this is the notion that in the case of capitalism, what we mean by abstraction is not, is not something that we might mean elsewhere in the sense of not real. Concrete is real, abstract is not real. What we mean in the case of capitalism is that the abstraction is real. Okay, so capitalism operates on the basis of real abstractions, and the abstraction of measured time, empty measured time, not determined by what's happening in the time, except labour in general, in the abstract, is at the very heart of capitalism. So at a very obvious level, if you're thinking about what kind of temporality is reflected in the music that is produced in a capitalist society, it's going to be likely to be abstract time. So there's a sense in which, whether you like it or not, it's kind of unavoidable. And all the philosophers who railed against it are kind of, missing the point here. This is how the system works, and you need to kind of get to grips with it. And it's not really surprising that music, if music is born out of the society, which is the materialist assumption at the heart of all this, theorizing, it's going to be not a time of flux, and Deleuze talks about hexicities, and I don't know, I forget the terminology, but the multiple different things going off in different directions and all the rest of it. It's going to be abstract time, because that's how the system works, if Marx is right, and I think Marx is right about that. That's the first thing about that, or maybe that's all of that, I don't know.
You link the development of groove to monopoly capitalism and Taylorist management method. How do these historical developments shape the rhythmic structure and social function of groove music?
Okay, so this is the next step, isn't it, in the argument? This is, how does abstract time manifest itself in the lived experience of people under capitalism, because that's necessary. There's a kind of, it's going to come via that, isn't it, from capitalism to music. So there's a kind of social history of capitalism that you can, or the beginning, the emergence of capitalism that you can do. You can talk about, for instance, the history of the clock and its invention, the beginning of the bourgeois era, right? And its gradual introduction into life, and the resistance that it faced from people who weren't used to organising having their days and lives and their labour organised according to the clock. Agricultural labour isn't organised that way, but as industrial labour was organised, then it played a greater part. And yes, all the way through to the way that modern in the time that we're talking about, the turn of the kind of 20th century, organisation of labour in factories and so on was subjected to Taylorism, time and motion. So this is a direct influence of clock time on every individual worker. I mean, people know about this Taylorism and time and motion and all the rest of it. Every little movement required to do any particular manual job is broken down into its tiniest components and given a time value that then is imposed on the work. So we have here the imposition by the system. So it doesn't, talk about Marx and abstract time can seem like a generality, but by the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, it's become the oppressive force that governs everybody's lives, not just in terms of the alarm clock that wakes you up to get you to work on time, but then when you're at work, the discipline on you to be doing the tasks in the time set for you by the boss. This is the strict imposition of abstract measured time on everybody's lives. And I make the point that, there's a kind of class differentiation here, isn't there, between those intellectuals, philosophers and so on, who have what I described earlier as perhaps a romantic response to this by harking back to a notion of time that isn't measure and is kind of full of the substance of life, which determines time rather than time determining what you're doing. But that kind of option is not open to the working class at this point in history. To think of another way that time could be organised is hardly something you can do when you're subject to this kind of discipline. So perhaps those kinds of critiques, Bergson and Husserl and so on, are utopian critiques in the worst sense of the word. They're completely futile in that sense. Don't get to grips with reality. What you get instead from the working class is you get resistance in the first instance to the imposition of clock time on their lives, and there's plenty of accounts of early agricultural workers rebelling against the rigidity of the working day and having to go back to work on a Monday. It's not that kind of resistance that is put up, not to measured time itself. What you get, and E.P. Thompson, the Marxist historian, makes this point very clearly, is that workers' organisations, trade unions, don't challenge the concept of measured time, but they use it to fight for their interests. So they fight for a shorter working day or longer toilet breaks or shorter working. I mean, this is the big demand of the late 19th century, early 20th century, the 8-hour day and so on. It's an acceptance of measured time as kind of inevitable or maybe even valid. Or recognition that you can't get rid of it. Capitalism works through measured time, but the resistance takes now the form of exactly how much of it is going to be imposed on you and in what form. So that argument's important in the sense that it seems to me that music that comes from what cultural theorists might call subaltern classes, the working class broadly speaking, which essentially popular music does have its origins in, is not in a position to reject the notion of measured time at all because its lived experience is measured time, and therefore it becomes a question of doing something aesthetic with measured time, which may loosely be analogous to fighting within the concept of measured time rather than saying we don't like this measured time and we rather time was still flux and whatever else.
You may have just answered this next question, but I'll ask it anyway, and if not, we can go for it quite quickly. In the final chapter, you explore how groove emerges from a form of artistic modernism, one that might be said to belong within the tradition of working class resistance to time discipline, whose early examples were studied by E.P. Thompson. What makes groove a subversive form of modernism? Okay, well, the modernism argument is worth dealing with. And I do make that claim because traditionally experimentation with temporality amongst other things, and popular music is not normally included, certainly by people who regard it as some kind of debased form or commodified form or whatever. So Adorno would be included in that. But I think I do want to make the claim that this is a valid artistic, aesthetic response to exactly the same conditions that produce the other artistic modernisms that we valorize as modernisms. It is a response to the social conditions, and in particular, as I'm describing it, the temporal conditions, and finding a way to reconfigure the way that they appear in art, let's call it, why not, in ways that at least form some kind of challenge. And I think in the best groove music, then that's what's happening. So I don't accept that this is simply an acceptance of objectivity as dictated by, the society of domination or whatever Adorno would call it. This is a way of working with the raw material, if you like, the temporality, the lived experience of temporality of 20th century capitalism, monopoly capitalism, and finding ways to use it in meaningful artistic ways, which isn't to say that every single instance of groove music is explicitly kind of revolutionary or resistive or whatever, but it is to say that this is a valid kind of aesthetic response, and one which
contrary to the view, and we kind of touched on this earlier with the Criminal Justice Act and all the rest of it, is not particularly appealing to the powers that be. Actually, there's probably a reason why, they're snobbish about it and say, well, it's just pop music and all the rest of it. They do find something threatening or subversive about it, not least because people gather in fields and spend the night dancing away to it and then don't get up for work on the Monday morning or whatever it is. But, short of that, we're talking about, Beethoven is revolutionary in one sense, but he doesn't scare the shit out of the ruling class. So we're not really, everything doesn't boil down to that. And that's where aesthetics comes in. Is it aesthetically valid? Is it, with that political component to it that Adorno shows is connected, his notion of aesthetic success in aesthetic terms is also political, has a political valence to it. So that's what I'm arguing, and I argue that it does, and some of the ways that it does are to do with, or some of the ways in which it's a kind of modernism are to do with the way that I argue that it presences us. If that verb makes sense. It posits a very strong presencing. When you're in groove music, and people have said this, there's been a few comments about this already, you feel like you're participating in this web of time. So let's go back to the argument about Beethoven is configuring of historical time. Let's accept Adorno's argument that Beethoven does it very well, and that his version, his constructions, if you like, of historical time are exemplary, right? From our perspective, from a Marxian perspective or a politically progressive perspective or whatever. Let's assume Adorno is right. Nevertheless, there is a sense in which this is a narrative of historical time. In other words, it's a story told about historical time from the outside. This is Beethoven telling us how historical time goes, right? He wrote it down on paper. The orchestra's learned to play it. Now they're going to give it to us. Did you like my story about historical time? That's what's going on there. And we might say, yes, we did like your story about historical time, but it's a narrative, and we are outside of it, right? Like we are with any narrative. And some people will argue that you have to be outside of things in order to grasp the meaning of things. But, I think that's challengeable. And that groove music tells another story about time. And the shape of time involved is different because we're now dealing with monopoly capitalism and abstract time and whatever, as I've just described. But something else is different about it, which is that rather than tell us a story about time, groove music kind of sucks us in to the time itself, and we live the time, the aesthetic time that we recognize somehow within it. So, that's what the question of, the way that the word groove extends to include dance. And even if you're not kind of dancing, then chances are you're tapping your foot or whatever, but also your brain is inside the music because it is this web of temporality that groove is draws you in and involves you in a present that is not an eternal present, because that would be a kind of stasis, and maybe some of the kind of trancey things do go that way. And also I think some of the, I don't include the minimalist stuff that you were talking about earlier. That's not groove music because, although it's highly rhythmic, it tends to blur a sense of temporal progression and almost create a sense of stasis or eternal presence or cycle. Yeah, right. Whereas groove, because of its metricality, is telling you all the time where you are temporarily, and it's moving you along this presencing point. When the drummer hits the backbeat, you are right on there with and it's now, right? And then it's now again. And you mentioned Benjamin earlier. I mean, I think his concept of Jetztzeit, now time, is useful, and I talk about that. And I talk about this being a very overtly political way of conceiving time, because it's a time in which moments are possibilities, because you're inside it and not being told about it. In the way I described Beethoven's kind of narrative mode of operating, then it's a bit like, there are possibilities in there, possibilities of change, of choice, of decision, and so on. And that links also to the question of improvisation, which is not a necessary part of this argument about groove, but does tend to go along with it. The fact that grooves are generally improvised. Grooves aren't written down in advance by a composer, by and large. I'm not saying it never happens, but by and large they are not, because they are woven out of the individual components and kind of woven together by people in participation. So that's another way in which it's not narrative, in which the time of the present is wrapped up in the time being conveyed. And I think that has political ramifications to do with, it's anti-historicist for a start off. The problem with narrative is that it conveys inevitability. Beethoven's story that I talked about conveys the movement of historical time. Let's assume, we were assuming that's what it does, but gives the impression that each successive event was inevitable, right? It unfolds logically. Okay, well, that makes it, and then that happened, and then that happened. Oh yeah, I can see how that follows from that. If that's your view of history, in reality, it's the view of history that people like Benjamin were totally against, for very good political reasons, because it suggests that history unfolds according to a plan. It's teleological. It couldn't have been any other way from the way that it was. That has all kinds of political implications for the present, because, the possibility of changing the course of history or, creating a revolution or whatever it is kind of off the agenda. If it's not written in there in advance, I mean, you might believe it is, but that's equally problematic. If you've got some kind of Stalinist view of how history inevitably leads to communism or something, then, that's equally problematic for underlying the reason which is the same reason underlying it. So I think that's an important argument as well, and it's a way of what is it a way of doing? It's a way of attributing political value without saying this music is positive because it's anti-racist or it supports this or it's in solidarity with the Palestinians or whatever. It's not that kind of politics. It's the politics of a historical understanding, a notion of time, which is the one that we have to work with and is positive for projects of engaging with the world and changing it. That's, I guess, ultimately what I've said. I've never said it in that way before. I think it's what I mean.
One of the questions I had in my head while you've been talking is how you'd map your theory of groove and the emergence of groove onto modernism in visual art and literature, which is the one I know most about, and it's kind of various resonances in what you've been saying there. For instance, the contrast with between modernism in literature and classical realism, in which you have that kind of that teleological narrative,
right,
in which characters develop and they learn through experience. Things happen to them, they come out at the end, or the tragedies might have happened along the way, but they come out a better person. Therefore, we have a better society. We have this progression. And those novels were written at a time when the bourgeoisie was confident about the future. And that began to break down later in the 19th century. And then you have novels which are much more open-ended. They don't have that closure. Open up various... You see opportunities within them for change in a different kind of society. So I think that fits. Does it fit with your notion of groove?
Yeah, I mean, immersing myself in those debates, around the turn of the century, the people that David mentioned, Lukács versus Brecht versus Adorno versus Benjamin and so on, are all trying to grapple with these problems. And then of course you've got the postmodern kind of thing thrown in there these days, which complicates the picture and it tends to suggest that no sense of, what should we call it, coordination or totality or overarching form or anything it should be allowed, because all of that is ultimately repressive and leads to totalitarianism and so on. So, there's a kind of modernism, but not postmodernism. I think there are postmodern composers, and they would definitely not be groove composers, because they would regard even the coordination involved in producing groove as stultifying or whatever, have that kind of picture. So there's quite a nice quote, and I put it near the end of the book, from De Boer, Society of the Spectacle and stuff, and he talks about, so he takes this question on about, what freedom looked. He talks about temporality, and he does a kind of historicizing of temporality. I don't know if people know this stuff. He talks about, how history was understood in the past and how it becomes changed and so on. It's like Hegelian tinge to it. But, he says, what would freedom look like from a temporal sense? And he says it's not, everybody with their own temporality. That might be a kind of anarchist view of it. It is different temporalities, but he calls them federated temporalities, he calls it, which I thought was quite useful. You can kind of get the picture here. Is there's a degree of freedom in terms of what people are doing, as it were, and the temporalities that they're involved in. But ultimately, because we're part of society, they have to be federated with each other. They have to be commensurated in some way, not in a way that one oppresses all the others, not objectivity suppressing subjectivity. But he's talking about democracy, isn't he? That's what I think he's talking about. And, in a sense, I see that being prefigured, if you like, in groove, where there's a whole bunch of, I talked earlier about polyrhythms, so the layering of different kinds of temporalities on top of each other to produce the kinds of syncopations that groove represents. One way of thinking about groove is that it's a whole bunch of different temporalities brought together, not just left floating about independently, brought together into a coherent whole in which none of them is oppressed, as it were, by another. Contrary to Adorno's argument about the beat and objectivity and so on. So there's another way of perhaps saying what might be positive about groove is it's democratic.
I was thinking exactly that. I think the most powerful argument is where you draw it together and say that it shouldn't be thought of as antithetical to modernism, but that it's a mode of modernism. Right. And that's, again, it feels very much like a riposte to Lukács, and actually located very much within those arguments of the 20s and 30s within the Frankfurt School, where instead of conceding modernism to Virginia Woolf and T.S. Eliot and a certain form of high modernism, what you're saying, no, we're going to actually reclaim the word modernism and say it extends to groove. Right. And groove is a legitimate way of responding to the crisis of the 1890s to 1930s, and continues to provide a mode of expression or form that should be read in the same way as you would read the other modes of modernism, in a kind of, not with a hierarchy in mind, but as a response to a particular historical moment. I think that's a really good way to end it. Sorry, that's a comment, not a question. That dreaded phrase.
Shall we end it there?
Yeah. David has succeeded in summing that.
That's a really good argument, I think. Myself, I'm persuaded.